Wouldn't it be great if you could be sure that those you spoke to actually care about what you're saying? We do. So much, in fact, that we have our first repeat guest on today's episode, and he's bringing more insights to help you succeed in business by finding the language you need to excel. And from his time covering politics in the White House, he also offers fascinating views on how the election is shaping up and why language sits at the heart of determining who stands to win.
In this episode, we are joined by Ben Feller. He is an award-winning writer and storytelling strategist who spent 2 decades as a journalist. This period included several years as AP's chief White House correspondent, covering President Barack Obama and George W. Bush. Afterwards, he transitioned to business, helping companies tell their own stories better by creating the language they need to succeed. Welcome back, Ben.
Art and Michael, thank you so much for having me back. I feel honored. I get that repeat title, like those hosts at Saturday Night Live. They start measuring their success by how often they're invited back. That's my metric of success.
We'll see too. What is it on Saturday Night Live? Is it 6? Like there's few who ever hit that range. So we'll see where our future.
All right, we'll measure that. That sounds good.
We might have to start doing more skits though too. To really, We're happy to have you back. Obviously, we always love digging a bit into some of the political side with you, while today we're talking business and politics, but we can't help but dive into that as we sit here, 6 months away from Election Day. There's a lot to unpack. There's a fair amount of, anxiety in the air from multiple sides. I guess you could say probably 3 sides. The side that says not this one, not either of them. And just, again, curious, because you've had this view of history so few have, where you were in the middle seat, first row, White House briefing room, when you were the chief White House correspondent for the AP. And if you could set the scene for us a bit, what's the mood of the electorate as we sit here 6 months away from this rematch between President Biden and former President Trump?
Anxious, unhappy, but not uninterested. I think that there's an interesting dynamic here where most of the voting public did not want this rematch to happen, or so they say. Right? We've been here before. It's very uncommon to have a rematch like this. So, whatever the latest numbers are, 2/3, 70+% say they wish that these were not the choices. However, that is not to be confused with apathy. I think people are incredibly animated about this. And so often, Michael and Art, we hear the most important election of our lifetime, and those phrases become so meaningless because they're all important, and they're all the most important if it's the latest one. I do think people feel differently about Biden versus Trump because of how the first Trump term went, obviously how people feel about Biden's term, but also what happened with January 6th and all the impeachments and the fact that former President Trump is now, in a courtroom as we speak. This feels like it's so weighty and so directional for the country that I think a lot of people care, but there's not a good feeling in the country right now about it. And so those two forces are kind of working against each other.
It's kind of wacky. I can't help but think how other countries look on, and this back to SNL, Saturday Night Live skit. Sometimes some of this might actually look like that to them. Obviously, language is an area you have great mastery over, and curious, so far, like what stands out to you about the language that these two candidates are using?
Well, first of all, this is a period of time when I think a lot of voters are really starting to pay attention in earnest for the first time. Once you get to about the 6-month mark, and, our firm focuses on the language that our clients need to win, particularly, the corporate world, the nonprofit world. And so it plays right into the political debate. Their news moments go up and down, right? But there's a pattern I think we're starting to see in the language for President Biden. He found something of a groove for him in the recent State of the Union, where I think he, when he was talking about you can't love your country only when you win. This idea of, freedom and democracy and what it means. And I know we're going to talk more about that. And he has been leaning into the age issue a little bit more playfully, saying, this isn't, he was here when he was the youngest, and now he's here when he's the oldest. And because that issue has gotten away from him as the oldest president. And even Trump, who's not that far away from him in age, has made an issue of it. So I think Biden is leaning more into a bit more the sharper edge that he, is not always his way, but he needs to do that, I think, to combat what Trump is doing to come at him. And for former President Trump, the language really hasn't changed. I mean, he chooses different adjectives, if you will, and different nouns to describe Biden, but he has this image that he laid out in his first inaugural of an America under siege, right? The carnage of our cities, and it's so dramatic and visceral, and he will not let that go. Before he was president, during his presidency, and now, he says things like, there will be no country, there will be no democracy, there'll be no America if I don't win. And now I think so many voters have heard this from both sides that this has become the new normal, this kind of language. When I covered the presidency, that was not normal to say. If you were to say there's carnage in the streets, so what just happened? But now the sense of nicknames and that visceral language has become normal, and both sides are still picking their moments, if you will.
I personally hate it, the language and this sort of thing, because it feels like it's so hard to actually focus on, for me, the language that I wish we were focusing on, which is like, the how each one intends to lead, the country or the world for that matter. And it becomes a bit of a distraction, but at the same time, you can't help it. Like when you do hear some of those things, like you said, that visceral response, when you look at democracy and it feels like democracy is in trouble, even though it's like, I actually don't know that democracy itself is in trouble unless either of these individuals is actually going to put it at risk. Meaning, I don't think it's something we as a nation and people are struggling with. I think it's something that the right leader, or just a leader who comes in, and has that mentality, has that potential to do. Do you think this language is more talk and not show, or do you think this language, because it's got a lot of people who are also fired up, has the potential to actually put democracy in some sort of a challenge position?
Look, the people that I talk to, even when the conversation isn't about politics, there's a sense of worry. There's just a sense of worry. I do think it is right beneath people's skins that what is going to happen depending on how this goes. And if you used to think that was just an idea, right, an abstraction, we saw, I still can't believe the images. We saw what happened when a group of people thought that the election was stolen, listened to the president at the time, and stormed the Capitol, right? And people got hurt and lost their lives on that. So this idea that democracy is at stake is real in that sense, right? Will there be political violence if an election result is not honored? What will happen if people's votes aren't counted, or there's an effort to find votes after the election? So I'm with you that really what would be great for the country is, how are you going to lead as a leader on the economy, on immigration, right, on civil rights? These are the issues, and a lot of them have it, but those are almost in the backdrop. The Supreme Court, Trump had a tremendous effect on the Supreme Court in his first term, but all those issues are secondary to really this idea of who are we going to be as a people. And I think that is honestly where the election is going to fall, when people say, who do we want to be as a people, whether you're for Trump or for Biden. And the economy and immigration and abortion are all going to be important, but I do think there's kind of a top line there that's different this time.
Well, and I also think what's interesting with that is how people are making their decisions, because again, if it's fear-based instead of based around, that influences it greatly. And again, going back to the language that we do use, it's like there's a reason, if you will, that a lot of marketing out there uses a technique at first of painting that picture of what you don't want instead of the picture of what you do want. And it can inform people's decisions that they make. You mentioned two, key ones here, not to put, the first one I could put a little more lightly, although some don't age, but the second one around freedom, being two of the key areas. What else are you seeing is the language that's being leveraged by each of the candidates, if you will?
I think there's this choice playing out between fairness and forgotten. So President Biden is leaning into this theme of giving everybody a fair shot to make it, which really borrows from his former boss, President Obama, who was struggling for his voice going for a second term and kind of founded around that idea. fair shot and a fair chance, and he was trying to pivot against Mitt Romney, who had a very different idea of an economy and kind of came from this idea of business success and wealth. And Obama's like, yeah, but I'm for you, right? And Biden is back to that and kind of leaning into that, the Scranton roots. Whereas Trump had so much success against Hillary Clinton around two things, if you distilled it down, before everything happened that we know him for in his first term. He was focused on Make America Great Again, the simplicity of that idea, which of course suggests that America had lost its way, which has all kinds of connotations to it, but it was a simple idea that people thought, like, we're lost, we can be found. And also this idea of forgotten Americans that were hiding right beneath the polling. You know what I mean? And the people that did not find themselves in Hillary Clinton's message. And so sometimes when Trump speaks now, he goes back to that theme of, I'm the guy that helps the forgotten people. If you don't feel like your life has gotten better during Biden's term, give me another chance again. But he doesn't consistently stay there, right? He goes all over the place with nicknames and derisives. But I think that most Americans don't really love the kind of color of the election and the mean-spiritedness. And they want to find that one thing that somebody says that's just like, yes, give me that. That's what I want. And I think both of them are trying that. If you're forgotten, I'm your person. If you want a fair chance, look at what I've done. Give me another shot.
Ben, what do you think, how much social media is polarizing some of this language? Because amongst like my just close friends, I keep hearing, I'm so glad Trump is back because we get some funny content again. And like that, to me, obviously it's the wrong reason to want somebody back at it, most powerful man in universe. But how much do you think social media polarization plays into which side somebody is going for?
Yeah, well, that's disheartening. I mean, I'm all for comedic fodder, and we started with Saturday Night Live, but I remember no matter, whether people were for Trump or against him, there was a sense of fatigue during that first term because it was a relentlessness of Twitter blasts, or what was then Twitter blasts all the time. And so, what was interesting about Biden when he took office is one of the things that he pledged to do beyond politics and policy and taxes was, I'm not going to be in your face. I'm purposely going to lower the temperature, not just because, it's my style, but I think we need to get back to a sense of you lead your life and I'll run the country and you'll see me at important moments. Whereas with Trump, he's like, I am the moment. I'm going to do this whenever I want, whatever I want, and my people will show up and force to support it. And so I do think that the social media polarization, it's like an accelerant, or, it's like, it's more and more. Did you see what he tweeted? And did you see what he did? And now the Twitter becomes the tweeting becomes part of the news coverage. And that it's just like this running cycle of debate without any stops and starts. I think with the Biden presidency, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but it feels like whether you're for or against him, there's like a pace to it, like there's an announcement, there's a decision, there's a lead up to something. There's not craziness overnight or on the weekends. And I think a lot of people, from the social media perspective, I haven't heard anybody say like, I want more verve, I want more dynamism, I want more activity. They might want that in their leader, but not in their social media activity. I'm just not looking for that, in what I do online.
Right. No, exactly. If anything now for me, and this is all throughout the election time, I actually, it's like looking forward to that relief at the end where it's like, however it is, at least it's like, oh, okay, hopefully there's a minimum, it minimizes how much of, I don't know, I find it like noise versus signal, and you're trying to actually figure out where the truth is, the signal out there through all of this. You had mentioned a couple things there I want to touch on. One of them is before you had said about how people are looking for some of the hope. And I think that will be interesting, especially as we look over the next several months, because it feels like fear and this risk of, democracy and these sort of things are all in front of us. That I do think that eventually, just like people have in other times in history, they do start to look to the thing that provides them hope. So it will be interesting to see how that informs any of this, if it does. I mean, not to say that lever can't still be pulled where you just keep ranking up that fear enough that, Obviously, that's that large enough, drive out there. I think a lot of the last election, some of that fear was also used to say, okay, let's get some voters out there, who were trying to, in that scenario, not see Trump in for a second election. But then at the same time, each side does it to the other one, and it creates this thing. But you were saying, because there's language, which is a core component, but the language without the right distribution might not ever be heard. And it made me think about something I was reading recently. Hopefully I don't butcher it too much, and you may know more details about this than I do, but it talked about how throughout history, you had the times, I think it was Roosevelt, where it was more around radio that all of a sudden, changed that pace of it. Then it was around, I think, Nixon and JFK, where I know there was a debate, like one of the first televised debates. And, in that case, Nixon sweating all these other things you get from him, under the lights and that. But JFK was a little bit more used to, that kind of a setting. He was more composed. And even though a lot of people would say Nixon actually might have won that debate when it came to things he said, JFK win with that new technology. Well, Barack, Obama eventually did it when it came to, I think, how he leveraged a little bit more, if I'm not mistaken, the social media end of things. And then Trump really around that Twitter side and controlling the story. Do you see anything like that today? Or are we at a point now where it's like, okay, this might be an election where there's no new, call it distribution or thing to get attention, or is it out there in front of us and we're just missing it?
I honestly think it's somewhere in between, and here's what I mean by that. Even though we're getting close to election day, I think we're still figuring out in real time what is that dynamic change, that paradigm change going to be, if there is one this election. I mean, we're three folks talking right now, putting this election and the language of it into context as if it's somewhat normal. It is not normal that one of the two guys running for president, right, is in a federal courtroom, right, under potential consequences of jail time on the charges of hush money to cover up crimes for his first election, and so I don't know what the channel change is going to be. I think it's almost it's almost a substantive question of how do we and how does the media cover this, and how does the voting public consume this? Because when Trump finishes a day in court, he goes over by the barricades and kind of opines about the Supreme Court and nicknames for Biden. And the media, I think, got really burned the first time with Trump covering him with those long, because he is colorful and he's great ratings. So what do you do? I think there's a lot of nervous newsroom executives about, do we go live? Do we go in tape delay? Do we only cover him when we're able to put it into context? And Biden's got a different kind of problem. He is noticeably, aging. So he knows this. He's now made light of it. So he picks his spots. He picks his spots like Howard Stern. He, it was really, Michael, the metric for his State of the Union was not how much it moved the needle on his poll numbers. It was, can he get through a nighttime speech with clarity and energy? And he did. Some people say, too much energy, but people are like, okay, there was this Democratic Party sigh of relief based on the fact that he could stand there and do it. So we're seeing some different factors. Trump's under the threat of jail. Biden's this, older guy, and is trying to have the stamina to kind of show he's got the stamina to do things. So I'm not as focused on the channels as I am what a crazy, it's like the most familiar two men in American politics, and yet the dynamic is different than last time.
Yeah. I mean, and speaking of language, how difficult it must be for Trump's team to spin the language to make his legal battles okay and seem like, it's not a big deal. I feel like it's anybody that's on the Trump side doesn't really care about all that legal battle, which is, I give credit to the language that his team is using.
Yeah. I mean, and ultimately this comes down to jurors, or one juror. So his lawyers are trying to make the case from a legal and factual perspective about did his behavior constitute, a crime or not. And just keep in mind, of course, this is just one of several legal fights he's facing. But a juror can decide for any number of reasons, they're out to get this guy, or I think he's guilty no matter what. or if you're even in the conversation of paying hush money to a porn star, you shouldn't be qualified for president. Like, jurors get to decide what their reasons are, right? They don't have to meet the legal criteria. So, but Art, yeah, you're right. I mean, there have been lots of stories about how his team feels hamstrung because he's an absolutist. I'm right, you're wrong. He's going to say what he's going to say. But they take those jobs for a reason. And by the way, judges are in these really hard positions of saying they have to be so determined to show fairness, not just in the courtroom, because they know how they're being covered, and you've got gag orders, and it's just endless. It really is endless. It's making me think of when Trump was in office, just talking about
right. Well, and that's the thing with these gag orders that is really interesting too. As you hear it, it's like, okay, I think I read about a fine or whatever it was again today, and it's just like, but that's Trump's brand. Like, he's always outspoken, even when he shouldn't be. But that's where a lot of people end up loving him for it, and others are like, oh my gosh, will you please? But it's really fascinating when you do look at the fact that, as you said, the age, and then you look at this other side of it that is, literally going through legal proceedings. But I do think that a lot of people look at it, and even some of them now are like, it won't change how they vote one way or another. Some of them are like, it might have a play on it. But it is so interesting how somehow, even for me, where I'm like, okay, I see a difference between, legal and age. And I still think, as I look at Biden, sure, does he slip up here and there? Yeah. But guess what? I also have loads of respect for. I just went and had celebrated my, I guess, grandma-in-law, you'd say 97th birthday. And she's sharp. She's that, it's like, gosh, the wisdom and the stories I get there. So it's like, I could also appreciate. But it's so interesting how when you do compare those two, suddenly it does feel like the language and that Trump has still, somehow there is this upper hand because he's got enough people who are like, don't worry about this trial stuff over here. He's still out pushing it. But then the age is not something you can change per se. You can try to improve the perception, but it's so interesting how something like that, even though for me, the trial, the related stuff, the law should play the most significant role when I'm thinking about, somebody's role in, well, any role really, but especially government, when they have to approach it with this level of integrity and honesty that you look for, that it's so fascinating. Have you seen anything like this in the past that you could think of with language where it was something that the candidates leveraged in a way that, we might look back now and say, oh, crazy that they were able to shape the story around that maybe we wouldn't have ever anticipated could have been, leading the world down a decision pathway?
Well, a couple things. First of all, just finishing off the thought about what matters, right? The trials or politics or whatever matters to voters. I saw a statistic from CNN recently that 92% of Republicans view Trump's first term as a success. So you might say, okay, well, Republican supporting a Republican, what's notable about that? First of all, that's an extraordinarily high number. And second of all, in Trump's first term, one of the equalizers, one of the big reasons why he wasn't reelected in a close election in key states was because of COVID. So we're in this conversation now. We could have easily gone through this whole podcast and not talked about COVID as if it was a thing in the past, and where, think about how many people in America died. Think about how much that was the only thing happening, right? Everything was shut down, and there was ridiculing people who wore masks. There was the idea of injecting chlorine into the veins. It'll be gone in a few days. Sunshine will, like, that all happened during Trump's first term. And, it was a horrible time historically in American life. 92% of Republicans look back at the first term and say it was a success, right? So my point to you, Michael, is the country is so entrenched. It almost, in a weird way, doesn't matter what happens in court or what happened last time or what they're going to promise, because they are set. So then what's the point of the election? Well, the point is that middle in Nevada and Arizona and in Georgia, right? And in the upper Midwest, those places, they're like, you know what? That did matter to me, that 1 million people died and we couldn't get a hang of it, or, I don't like how that felt. Or Biden said he was going to calm things down and restore order, but I'm still out of work. I'd rather go back to the other guy. Like, it's those folks who are going to determine the election. And for them listening, they'd say, no. A lot of this stuff matters. You know what might matter to them? If Biden and Trump debate, which has kind of been off the table. Remember, to talk about nostalgia, debates used to matter. Your point about Kennedy and Nixon. So if a debate happens, even just one, then you're going to have all these language moments that could determine it. So that's what I'm looking forward to kind of spin this ahead. Real quickly on your other question, Reagan ran for re-election against Mondale, and it was, a famous landslide. I think Mondale won maybe his own state, maybe. But in that election, age was an issue. So Reagan is now younger. Reagan was younger then than Biden is now, but he was, I think, the oldest president at the time. And when asked about it in a very pointed way by a reporter, he said, I'm not going to make age an issue in this election. I'm not going to use my opponent's youth and inexperience to mock him. That wouldn't be fair. And turn the whole thing on its head that even Mondale laughed. It's like, oh, I didn't see that coming, and Reagan was great at that and sort of diffused it. It's like, yeah, you know what? For everything you talk about age, for me, this guy hasn't even done it before. So let's just end that debate. And there have been those moments when covering Romney and Obama, Obama lost that first debate against Mitt Romney. And people kind of forget this because they think about Obama's 8 years as kind of a foregone conclusion. It never was. The first one wasn't, and the second one wasn't. But after that first debate, Obama kind of mailed it in. His staff was apoplectic. Like, you're going to lose. And for the second debate against Romney, his language was sharper. He came in that ready to fight, and you could see it. And the coverage was that way. The voters were that way. And so we can't minimize body language and energy as deciding factors. And I think that we're going to see that play out here too.
That's a great point. I can't help but say or think about when you say some of that do, though, because it was that controlling factor of the age, although it is interesting when you look at the years, now that people are putting out there. Do you think there's anything right now that either of the candidates should be doing from a language perspective that they're not doing?
Look, I think for President Biden, I don't think he can risk in any sense being conservative. Like time is getting short. Time's getting short, fat. It's getting late early, like he's got to go. And I think you're starting to see that. And so it's not only the language, it's actively seeking moments to get in front of people and draw the contrast. And that has really been working against him up until I'd say about the State of the Union. Hadn't really found he wasn't contested genuinely in the race. And so he didn't have a reason to be out there. But I think he needs to keep making that case. And people are going to see an older version of Biden than beat Trump the last time. If they haven't really been paying attention to it, the more he's out there. But they just have to own that and say, that's not the issue. I think, for Trump, he's done a Trumpian job of taking setbacks and turning them into political levers and advantages and fundraising tools. And so, his playbook is totally up to him. He's a playbook counselor of one, takes his own guidance. You could map out all these things of where he should campaign and what kind of events he should do. I think we're going to see how this first trial plays out. It's really going to be the only one litigated before the election. And I genuinely think we're going to continue to see the same from Trump. He's going to seize on the news of the day. He's going to hammer Biden and crooked. Any of his enemies are, any of his opponents are enemies. The media is the enemy. And I'm curious, Michael and Arden, to see how he plays to those states I mentioned earlier, because it's going to come down to those. What's he going to do there?
It makes sense. Quickly here too, and because maybe you have a better perspective than I do on this, but the whole not really debating thing, is that both sides, or is it more Trump who hasn't wanted to do the debates? What are you seeing when it comes to each of their decisions?
I think, Biden said he would debate when asked about it by Howard Stern, and I think it'll work. I think it'll work to his advantage. Even with all the flaws that we've just talked about, he's got a very strong message to tell by contrast of how he leads versus how Trump leads. Basically a version of what he did in the State of the Union. Except this time he'll name him instead of saying he did my predecessor thing. Like, you don't deserve to rise to the level of this, speech. Now, as we're getting into true campaign mode, that's coming up. But yeah, of course there are risks, right? It's right now on the national polls, which don't matter that much because the election is decided in a few states, but he's down in the polls. And so, if you have a bad night, I think I wrote once on that first one, like, Obama picked a bad night to have a bad night. A lot of people are going to be watching. If there's only one, there's a lot of risk there. I think he needs to take the risk. For Trump, it's just such a wild card. The issue with Trump debating is not does he win or lose on messaging or points. It's just does he ram through the moderators and the opponents and the audience and the TV screen to the point where it's hard to even hear, which happened at one of the debates. I think people are kind of turned off by that, and the moderate voters might be like, my God, if he can't stand there and debate Biden for one night, that's the risk for him. Can he kind of keep his fire like into bites and then stop? I think he could win if he did that.
Well, I think at this point they should just make it a big pay-per-view deal, and so everything that you're saying, and I think the idea here still of just the key importance of language takes me to the workplace and workplace politics, because obviously there's as much as we could hear this and watch this and be like, boy, this is crazy. Like, look, I think a lot of us could go back in our own jobs and be like, oh yeah, there was this, or remember the boss who's running into this, or the coworker who was doing that. And then sometimes I think in those situations, people are also, again, leveraging or winning their arguments simply based on how they're positioning it. So I'd love to shift over for a moment over here to winning in business, and still the language of winning that we want to discuss here. But when it comes to entrepreneurship, career growth, side hustles, you're a big believer in starting with the right mindset of winning in business. But before you get to the language of winning, we love this tagline of your firm that you have, which is, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. Can you bring to life for our podcast listeners what that really means and why it's a mindset you suggest?
Yeah, particularly for folks who are in business, who are entrepreneurial, either within their business structure or they're doing side hustles. I think the mindset is so important when you think about what can I do? What channel can I be on? All these things you typically think. The mindset that I strongly suggest is it's not about you. Like, you have to start with the audience mindset. So when we say it's not what you say, it's what they hear, take the time to think about your audience and what they need. What do they need to hear? Put yourself in their shoes, whether you're interviewing for something, seeking their business, seeking their partnership. It's really, if you shift your mindset, it's not that hard. Think, okay, I know what they're up against. I've read their financials. I know where they are in the marketplace. I've read the job description. Like, I'm going to come into this thinking, not assuming, but thinking these are the things that they have indicated to me that matter to them. So let me make sure that I'm tailoring my message, not just to what the best thing I have to offer about myself, but what do they need to hear? And you just bridge this gap between talker and listener so much faster. It doesn't mean that you're, abdicating who you are based on who you're talking to, but so often speakers and business people, entrepreneurs, skip that step. And so if you break down the way they talk and you look back at it, it's like, wow, that was a lot about you. Your idea, your offering, your background, your distinction, your discount. It's like, well, you're trying to get something from me, right? My time, my attention, my interest. And so as a mindset shift, starting there, I think is so healthy. And I've seen this across our work, across sectors. And what we do, Michael, is in a typical project, we spend time with those audiences. So if you're trying to reach a particular category of doctors, we talk to the doctors, right? Customers in the Midwest, we genuinely spend time with them. Now, person by person, you're not always going to have the time to do that. But as a mindset shift, it's so healthy.
What you were just saying, Ben, right away, my mind goes to a company like Amazon, which is so driven by customer first. And everything they do is kind of back up from what the customer thinks. But then you go to some other, famous entrepreneurs in the world. One I can think of is like Henry Ford, where I remember a line about, if I asked the customer, they would have said, give me faster horses. They would have never said, give me a car. How do you balance that in this space where sometimes a customer might not actually know what they want because they don't have all the information and the language is not there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic case of, are you meeting market demand or are you creating it? Right? People weren't clamoring for the iPhone before it came out. Now it's impossible. I'm picking that model because I use it, but you know what I mean. Like it's everything whenever you want. It's frustrating if you don't have internet connection for 9 seconds in between subway stops here in New York City, right? So it's like, okay, well, that wasn't the audience telling me that, but actually it was in some ways, right? The best inventors and innovators and entrepreneurs see that they can create a market demand, but it's not because they think it's cool. It's because they know what do people want, right? So in the case of, an automobile versus a horse, transform life, right? In the case of a faster phone or whatever it may be, you're still thinking about the audience. Now, in that case, you might have a bigger burden to say, like, here's the thing you weren't even talking about. I do need to bring you into it. But even that, I think you're really thinking about where the market is. It goes back to this idea of, I'm going to respect your time by showing that I'm putting my story in the context of you.
So slightly different question here, but curious again, based on a couple of things you just said. So I think you've hit it, I've hit it. There's these inflection points that some of us have in our careers, and curious, what's the number one piece of advice you have for someone who feels stalled in their careers and wants to find the next great thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this, Michael, in terms of what to feel and what to do. So let's spend at least a second on the first part, because a lot of times we don't. And what to feel is that it's okay to feel however you're feeling at one of these points where you're stalled. If you decide to leave something for something better, that's pretty straightforward if you have the something better, right? The traditional career path, either, up or over, however you want to do it. But if you don't know what that next thing is, and you decide to leave something that is weighing you down, and you have the financial freedom to do that, at least for a little while, it's going to feel probably pretty damn liberating. It's also going to feel scary as hell. At least from my experience and from people that I work with. They say, well, how could it be both? Well, because we're humans. I don't know what I'm doing next, but I believe in myself and something's going to come, right? So if you're at a career point and you're not making a move for those reasons, I would say lean into those. Like, that is good, healthy growth. The hardest, that feeling is right, as somebody told me this once, I'll never forget it. That feeling you're feeling is right before the good thing happens, right? Because you're making it happen. And then my advice on what to do is, get the story of you down to where you love it, right? The one paragraph of you that applies to any sector. You're still going to be thinking about your audience in the context of what you're doing with it, but don't make it this mushy little bit of everything, right? That people go, okay, so what is it? Like, what's the thing that you do best? What are you known for? Like, well, you know what, 8 years ago, he's like, no, don't tell me about 8 years ago. If you can't articulate, here's exactly who I am, what I do, what I'm known for, or what I want to do next, then your hirers, right, your partners, they're not going to go there with you. And so like, oh, I got that. Well, try it. Try writing the one paragraph of you. It's harder than you think, but you nail that. Everything else flows from that. Your videos, your resume, your CV, your case studies, your references, but you got to get that story right. That's the one. And time again, I've had that conversation. I've had to do it 3 times in my life. But then you send something out and you're like, well, you know what? I can't control how they react, Michael, but I can control how I presented myself. And that's pretty empowering.
Yeah. I was just going to ask a follow-up question. During that process, there probably is a lot of anxiety. And some people will kind of use that anxiety and say, oh my God, this isn't for me. Let me run back to what felt comfortable. What advice do you have around this notion of comfort and getting yourself out of the comfort zone?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a believer in saying that if you stay in what's comfortable, that's necessarily a negative, right? The term is meant to convey a sense of peace, joy, relief, a happy status to be, comfort. The trouble becomes if you know you're really not happy, and the reason why you're not doing something about it is because the fear of being uncomfortable. That's the part. Like, I'm not suggesting to leave comfort if you actually are happy, but if you're unhappy, then going back to what's comfortable, it's just something that I can't really live with. I don't know how else to say it than that. I've left, I remember when I left the White House beat, and Obama had just won re-election. They had already had the stage set up for his inauguration. So I left the White House for the last time. I used to work in a little booth in the West Wing. I walked past the structure of the the shell of the stage. And it was loud and it was cold. And I remember stepping into a little bank vestibule, like where the ATMs are, so I could get some heat. And I called my sister. I called her back and I said, hey, anyway, and here's I am. And she just said, I don't know what happened to you today, but man, did you sound different. Because I don't think I didn't tell her the story the way I just told you. I was just returning a call to my sister. But she's like, what is going on? You just sound like a totally different person. People could hear the lightness, right? So I was going into the uncomfortable, but I didn't sound uncomfortable because the first feeling is like, okay, I get to do something different now. And then a week or two goes by and you're like, damn, this is pretty uncomfortable, right? But knowing what you want to do and believing in yourself, I think will get you through that. And most successful people have had these periods of discomfort. Would you guys agree?
Oh yeah, 100%. Again, for me, myself personally, been there, and can absolutely relate to that. But again, also, there is that balance sometimes between, for me, the anxiety of it all, but then at the same time, again, liberating, as we talked about in that other way. And there is a certain, I don't know, freedom. Trying to think of even how you describe it, the right words for it. But yeah, 100%. I'm curious, as you mention these things, so much of it ties back to mindset. Is there a piece of language that, you recommend people use in these moments? Because again, the language we use for ourselves is equally important as we ultimately try to convince ourselves into the things that we probably should be doing. It's easy to look at the external language of how that might be used, but for our own selves, language is really important as well. What do you use to help yourself in those moments to get in the right place?
I think that it's easy to forget somehow that so many of these conversations, did they go well or not? People come out of, an interview and somebody says, how did it go? Right, well, unless in that moment they immediately said you're hired or this is never going to work, right? Usually you don't get that feedback right away. So when people say, how did it go? What are they asking you? They're asking you for a feeling, right? For a vibe, for a sense. You're reading the room. Okay. So how do you determine that? Well, they seemed really attentive. We seemed to be having a good conversation. They were nodding along. Like they enjoyed my stories. They didn't know this. These are all things that come to human interaction. And so I think it's not so much a piece of language I would suggest as an understanding that trust that all of these moments matter and make every setting about a personal interaction. Not how well have you studied the company's financials and annual reports, or that you can quote that you saw them in a Forbes piece 18 months ago. Like, that's great. That's research. But I mean, the connecting one-on-one, really listening. And then when people say, so do you have any questions for us? Have really thoughtful questions. And you know what? They might be based on something you heard 5 minutes ago. You've done this to me 3 times already in this interview. Like, wait a minute, I was really struck by that. What do you mean? Can you go deeper into that? And if you're showing that you're intentional about the moment and capturing it, then all that other stuff will play in. Your resume, your background, right? But pay attention to the moment. So it's the language moments often happen by remembering that these are human interactions. And what's also going to happen, Michael, is that person on the employer end, they're going to walk down the hall and somebody's going to say, hey, I saw you were the candidate in there with Michael. How'd it go? And, they're not going to say, oh, I really like bullet point number 7. They're going to say, engaging, got it, smart, prepared, focused. Like, these are human qualities. And I think that goes into the language as much as anything that you would write down.
I was just speaking to actually coaching client around this regard, because she was preparing so much for actually her interview, and so much that she's like, can we run through one more time? I'm like, look, you're good when it comes to the things that you prepped for at the sort of high level of making sure you hit the bullet points. The key now is that you do go in there, and at this point, wow, this might sound a little too, I don't know, lighthearted around it. I'm like, the big test that people are going through is this a person I want to work with? Would I want to have a beer with this person? Whatever it might be, because that's a key piece. And then, that other one I think that ties into what you're saying is are you giving that individual significance? And sometimes with the questions you ask back to them and the curiosity and things you lead into it can do that. And I absolutely like agree of like, how do people make sure that they're in that moment enough that they're not just thinking about what it is that they want to get out or make sure they hit these points, but instead thinking about how they make sure that person in there actually gets the sense that they are having a conversation, with them versus just trying to get through, I don't know, whatever that goal is, which for them is to get the job, but you're more likely to get the job if you find ways to make that person who's interviewing you feel valued, for lack of a better way to put it, significant.
Michael and Arden, this is such an important point. I'm glad you went there because I can't remember if we talked about this before, but I remember in an interview once where my firm was in consideration for a piece of business, and the potential client said at the very end, your bona fides are really strong. We like your approach. We just want to ask you, how can you ensure that working with you will not just be effective, but enjoyable? And I love the question. I love the question so much, I almost wasn't even worried about the answer, which is why I looked at my teammate in the room and oh, don't worry about that. I'm effective and he's enjoyable. And that made them laugh. And I'm like, okay. So my partner was like, wait, that makes me ineffective? And I was like, but by the time, I didn't really care what he thought because they were laughing. And so, you could turn that around if you're at an inflection point in your career and you're thinking you're going through an interview process and you're deciding. When I was in the period that took me from my last job into where I am now, it was Landscape Partners. And I ran into a great friend on the street. And, first of all, I looked liberated again, right? Because I was in that in-between state of deciding. And he said, hey, how's it going? Did you find a job? And I looked at him strangely. He's like, oh, wait, did we talk about this already? I'm like, no, I never thought about it that way. He's like, what do you mean? What did I say wrong? I'm like, well, I'm not looking for a job. I'm deciding what I want to do. And he's like, oh, because I had a job. I left the job for something different. I was deciding what I want to do. Now that comes from a place of privilege, but it also comes from a place of mindset and confidence that I'm going to find something that I want to do. And you could turn that around. If you're interviewing, you could say to the people who are interviewing you, say, listen, when I come to work here, if I'm chosen, I'm planning to be effective. And, I really want to be part of something that's enjoyable. Do you guys value both? And then we're going to say, they're probably going to say, of course, we want it to be effective. But they're like, well, how do you ensure that? How do you measure that? How do you measure enjoyability as well as effectiveness here? And I bet they'll love that question. They'll probably start talking about how important it is that the people are likable, what they do outside of work, the culture, and then a candidate will bring that. And maybe they won't, they'll be like, you know what? I don't give a damn. You make your numbers, you're fine. If not, you're out. Either way, you learn something.
Totally agree. I think those are great questions to ask because, back to it. It's like you at least now know, nope, not a good match. It's like, I love the ones where people hype up culture and that kind of stuff. And then when you actually ask them, so what are your favorite things about the culture? Like, it's like, oh, so no, I think that's great. It's because you're dating. In many ways, you're dating and you're trying to understand them. And if you want to go on future dates, but yeah, it does light them up. And especially, the right person you're talking to who does try to embody and does want to make sure that they're not just showing up at a job each day, but they're showing up somewhere where, whatever their reasoning is, their why, or just personally or larger for the organization, if you could connect to that, yeah, I think that makes such a huge difference. What you just touched on, I think, has a relationship to entrepreneurship in general, but I'm just, curious, what have you found effective in growing your business, either your own or as part of, current firm, make sure I don't butcher it, Maslansky and Partners, right?
Right. So for your viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with us, the short version is that we're in the language business. We are hired to find the language that helps our clients win by finding exactly the right wording to make their audiences listen, care, and act. And if you can do those three things, you're going to win. It's really hard in a busy environment if they don't know you and they have reason to be skeptical to stop and pay attention and then care about it and then do something with that information. So that's why we get hired. Listen, I think that in some ways, honestly, at this stage of my career, I wish this wasn't the case, but it is definitely the case. Hustle is so often the winning determinant, and follow up. And those are not sexy takeaways. Like they're pretty important when you're new in a career. I'll show my hustle and I'll follow up. But after a while, you want your reputation and all the client successes you have in your network to say like, okay, well, I want it to be on this this higher level thinking, this, to your point, Art, and like this new innovation. But hustle and follow up are baseline table stakes. I take that for granted. Or you know what? Somebody younger on my team who's got more stamina, they'll do the hustle and I'll come in for the key moments. If you're trying to make it, particularly as an entrepreneur, I think the degree to which you hustle continues to be a differentiator. I'll give you an example that just popped to mind. I'm giving a speech later this spring to an audience of government communicators. Okay, so when I was a reporter, I covered the White House press secretary, Robert Gibbs, Jay Carney, Josh Earnest. They had the top government communicator job, or one of them in America. But there are folks who hold that position all over the country, you know, fire emergency management agencies and town halls and the like. So they're all coming together, and I'm going to be a keynote speaker at their conference. The people who chose me for that had never heard of me before. I went to them, and they said, go ahead and submit your idea in the portal. Well, there's nothing really that personal about a portal, right? But I said, okay. And then I followed up, and then I got chosen. And then they called me back and they said, listen, we don't want you to do a breakout session. We'd like you to be a keynote speaker for the whole conference, because we never had somebody with the White House background. And I said, great. And so they said, can we get on the phone and talk about it? So I had this great conversation with the director, and he said, yeah, for this reason, that reason. He said, by the way, man, you just really wanted it. We've never had somebody follow up like you. And it was like, that was the best part of the conversation, because to me, the follow-up was second nature. Like, I don't just submit something to a portal and wait, like show some attitude, show some verve. And then if you're being a nudge, pull back. But then if you need to be a nudge, be one. Like, so always be doing that. And then, so for folks who aren't doing that and listening, they're like, I'm not getting anywhere. I should probably do some more networking, that kind of passive voice. Own it. Do it.
Yeah. No, I think that is so important. And the follow-up, I mean, even so many times in a workplace with our own team and stuff like that, people are like, looking for opportunity. I'm like, great, you could do this. And it's like crickets. You never hear back sometimes. It's like, so did you really want this? I think you wanted the outcome, but maybe, you know, the effort you had to take to get there wasn't it. But when you mention both follow-up and hustle, what I try to lean into oftentimes, and what I try to always coach my team around, is match or beat the other person's urgency. And by that, it is that, you know, you want to be one step ahead of whatever it is that they're going to, you know, be looking for or chasing you around. Because when you're able to do that, then the follow-up becomes natural, because you want to beat them to that, you know, you don't want them coming back to you and be like, hey, we never heard from you, or what's going on here on this, or I don't want to show up somewhere. They'll be like, remember that? Because then you know, maybe it's my own not wanting to let other people down. That was a huge drive of that. But then that also naturally pushes hustle too, because you want to get to it. And I think for me, that actually always made things even easier, because otherwise there's this weight, you know, like with Parkinson's law, where you're sitting there with this thing anyway, you know, you should, it floats in the back of your head. You're not always enjoying those moments, because I don't know, I think about it as a hot potato. I'm like, let's close that loop, get it back out there, because then that's one mental switch I can turn off and actually, you know, enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, look, and it's reinforced if the follow-up and the hustle works. If it doesn't, then you're like, okay, this is going into a void. But at some level, you have to have faith. That's where that example I was giving you earlier about making a personal connection counts. You know, I just had a call earlier today, and the person that we met with had said it's really important that it happened at the beginning of the week. And then we didn't hear anything. We were setting times, and I'm like, listen, I talked to my system, like, I think I should weigh in. Yes, please. So I said, I'm sorry to be a nudge, but you said you wanted it to happen. And she's like, thank you. Thank you for being a nudge. Let's do it at 11 a.m. 11 a.m. call. Okay. So that's like a very minor example, but you'd say like, oh, I don't want to offend. That's just read the room, be yourself, you know, keep going. A lot of times it is going to end up with crickets, which is frustrating, but man, it's like, what else can you do, guys? Like, you know, that's why people will say, you see all these different, so like your first email will get read if you use this word versus that word. Like maybe, but how about developing relationship, having some humility, having some hustle, right? Offering something that is based on what they need. And if it's not going anywhere, say, all right. But if it feels like it might like come back later, you do that across the spectrum of people, you're putting odds in your favor.
I love it. And I think also when you look at whether it's not experiences people have had with home services business, whether they look at it with, you know, call centers, whether they look anywhere else, it's like all of that resonates, because it is something that usually ends up negatively impacting a business, because when you're on the other end of that and you're not getting any of the sort of sense of, you know, what shows the person on the other side, they're important, then you start to lose that trust with them. You had, obviously with your journalism background, in that being, a large chunk of your life, how has that informed your entrepreneurial role now, and what can our listeners learn from that?
So a couple answers come to mind. The first is, everybody wants the answers, and I'm in the consultant business. And so you think, is your consultancy going to answer our problem, answer our questions better than the other guys? Well, the answers come from the questions. That's why, when I left journalism and went into consulting, the firm I worked with for a lot of years, Mercury Public Affairs, when I was choosing, right now looking for a job, as we talked about, but choosing, they said, well, listen, you're going to do well in this job because there's going to be a room with important people in it. And the leader of that conversation is going to say, we don't know what to do. Ben, what should we do? And either you're going to know the answer based on your experience, or you're very specifically not going to know the answer at all. And you're going to say that, and you say, but I know the questions to find out. So the journalism experience is predicated on every day, new challenge, blank screen. You're covering wildfires, and then you're covering the sudden resignation of a top official, and there's some, political fight in the state house in Wisconsin that somehow is affecting the debate that you're covering. You don't know all those things. You got to, what is it? What matters? And so in consulting and being a business advisor, it's the same thing. And I try to get right to the questions. And what's really reaffirming, even after all these years, is they'll say, okay, Ben, do you want to start us off? And I'll ask some foundational question. And they'll go like, yeah, good question. Like, that's the thing that we're stuck on. I'm so glad you asked that. And it's like, okay, I'm glad that you like the question, because we're connecting back to the human connection, but also I'm gonna not waste your time. Let's get to the heart of the issue. Well, how did you get straight to the heart of the issue in the first question? Because I've been thinking about the right question. That's journalism, right? Then what do you do with the answer? Well, in that case, it was to write it in a way that mattered to the readers. In this case, it's use the information to help solve their problem. But don't come in like expecting all this stuff. And it's just ask questions you don't know. I think one of the worst things that happen in sort of American business and just in American conversation is people's unwillingness to say, I don't know. Like, that it became a weakness. Like, guys, I don't know a lot of things. Like, I don't know. So when I find out, my son called me yesterday because it started to rain. And he had a baseball game in an hour. And he calls me, he's like, Daddy, do I still have to go? I said, to the game? I go, yeah. I go, how would I know? And well, his first answer is because, like, you're my dad. So, like, okay. So then, Mom, you're supposed to know, come on, And he's like, I don't know. I just thought because you were close to, and he was about to say the coach's name. I'm like, God? Close to, is it going to stop? Is it going to stop raining in half an hour? And he starts laughing at me. I'm like, no, I go, I don't know. There's probably a hotline. I'll call the coach. Like, but I don't, but he was shortening the phase. And so I think that that's really the main thing. And then last thing, Michael, is, it comes back to hustle. My dad used to tell me, he's like, you're a great reporter because you're always running scared. Now think about that. There was a movie that came out, I think, in the 80s with Billy Crystal, Running Scared. We saw it when I was a kid. But it's like, yeah, you're like, you run like somebody's chasing you. You run like you're going to get beat. You're like, well, that's because that's how I feel. It's not a tactic to trick myself. He's like, yeah, but when you're doing that, you're always running. Right. And so I think that's part of it too, as a reporter, and the same thing in business. Like, what's this? Who's going to beat me? It's not the most healthy place to live. You got to leave that place for a while. But those two things, asking questions and running like you're scared, look up and you'll be having a lot of people behind you.
As you made kind of this transition from a very, at least from an outsider perspective, a sexy job in journalism and reporting, and going to entrepreneurial and with your firm, what's one thing that you wish somebody had told you before you became a partner in the firm?
I think it's, don't lose sight of what makes you happy. I think about it a lot. I've talked about it with you guys. I wrote a children's book for kids and parents about perspective. You'd think that I would know this, and I continue to do it. Don't lose sight of what makes you happy. It's, of course, if you measure your day by meetings and calls and times in the car, the subway, you're not going to be able to do that. Like, oh, in this little block, am I happy? But big picture. And so if you look up and it's been 2 years, 3 years, and you're doing fine, you're meeting your metrics, but you're not really happy, it's like, well, then why are you there? That could be because you're paying the bills. That's a totally laudable thing. But there are other places where you can pay the bills too. And so I think that, I sometimes get so focused on helping clients find the language to win and doing what I need to do to be successful as a business person, that I'm like, well, if you add all those things up, therefore I'll be happy. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You know what also counts, guys? Path along the way. The path along the way, like while you're doing the doing, how are you feeling? You don't get to have that mindset as much when you're early in your career, because you know what? Do the job, like earn your keep, move up. But then as you start to go and, you've got limited time to get things done, it's like, all right. So I wish that I had heard that more. Or maybe, Artin, somebody saying, you know what, man, you worry enough for 10 people. Don't worry so much. No one has said that to me ever. It's like, oh, keep worrying.
And on that note of just pursuit of happiness, and maybe a way to wrap up here is just your story in general, and what you've picked up throughout your career and experience. Can you tell us a little bit about your own pursuit and what it could mean for others?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of what we started talking about at the beginning of the podcast was about language, and a lot of my story comes back to language. But I think, as it's so obvious from this, is like, this comes down to a feeling, right? How are you doing? And that feeling that you either carry, I often find myself pointing to my chest, like, is it tight or is it light? And so my pursuit of journalism was built on, like, I love this. I love finding out things and educating people. And I like that the better I get, look at these opportunities that are happening. One day, all of a sudden, I'm on Air Force One, and the president turns to me, he's like, okay, AP man, go, or we're going to take the first question. Okay, that's Ben from the AP. Hey, Ben, how you doing? Like, pretty heady stuff, right? So that kept me going for a long time, except at some point, the chase became exhausting and repetitive. And I hit the top, and my bosses were like, what else you got? And so I'm like, wait a minute, that chest is tight, but I'm doing the thing I love. Wait, you know what happened? Values changed. Life priorities changed. And so, my pursuit of happiness is now not a pass-fail thing. It's ongoing. It really is ongoing. It's why I landed in this job. It's why I wrote the children's book. It's a big reason why I keep finding myself wanting to talk to you guys is conversations like this, because I think we all are searching for ways to help each other and help others, but we need it too. Like, why do we listen to other people's podcasts? Hey, you should listen to this. This is a great idea about how to maximize your mornings, just to pick one. Like, I'm still trying to do that. I'm still trying to maximize my mornings after all these years, because the pursuit goes on, Michael, like that's why. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that.
Love it. I have to almost just recap my own connection I'm making here for some of the things that you're saying, because between the things that you mentioned with, the questions, and earlier on, asking good questions, and earlier on you mentioned kind of understanding, I think about it as market research, but when it comes to it, with whoever you're meeting with and understanding a little bit about them, it doesn't mean you got to, go over the top in your, preparation and make it just about showing off your key points that you learned about them, but it's really understanding the people that you are looking to make the connection with. And then you mentioned that hustle and follow-up, and all of those things for me actually are, I think, cornerstones to building good relationships. And because, again, you're really making it about that person on the other side. Even your follow-up and your hustle is showing them a level of importance and that you care about it, even though you're right. Sometimes those people may not even care about that follow-up. But, just as I got some of that sprinkled in here, I just wanted to bring it up because I do really think that those things in their own right is, a core secret to human relationships. So no matter what people want to be able to achieve, and maybe somewhere in there is some of the secret of language, because language strives, to do that in the right language that you choose. So where can people find you?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that recap.
There was so much more than what I recapped, but that's just
no. I love hearing it back. It really is affirming and a lot of fun. You guys are getting to know me well. People that do know me well, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, know I'm careful with my words. And I use the word fun judiciously, and thinking through how people hear a conversation like this, connect to it, reflect on it, read it back. Like, that's fun for me because it is really all that stuff is in pursuit of relationships. You're 100% right.
But I left joy out of there. I should have included that, by the way.
Joy is good. Thank you. People can find me at mslansky.com, which is our website for our company, Ms. Lansky and Partners. And I'm also on LinkedIn, Ben Feller, and post pretty frequently about thoughts on language, thoughts on life, parenting. We have our own podcast at the firm called Hearsay, because it's not what you say, it's what they hear. Lots of different ways to engage and track me down. If anybody's interested in learning more, just find me on LinkedIn or at our company website.
Sounds good. And then any of those places also work if people need to know what the weather is going to be and if the rain's going to clear up?
You know what? Just call my son.
Yeah. That would be a great...
I'll turn it back on him. He's 12. He can deal with it.
Yeah. He can handle it now at this point. Great. And then anybody else who's interested also, I believe it's episode 30, but we'll link up below where they can learn more about you and hear about more of your pursuits that you shared with us last time, which are equally as fascinating. Otherwise, thanks for coming. And, who knows? Again, back to Saturday Night Live thing. We'll probably be seeing you again.
Hey, look, I know it's going to be a totally tame, lame, quiet election season, but in the chance that things perk up and you want to talk about it once more, who knows? Maybe there'll be something new to talk about. I'm happy to come back.
That's great. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Art, and thank you, Michael. Enjoyed it.
Take care.